3 of our tomato diseases. We did fungal and bacteria, virus, nematodes, and now we're going to talk about non-infectious diseases with just stuff that just happens.
Kind of environmental
Environmental problems.
Good thing is these are a lot easier to diagnose than our others. So,
a little bit more obvious.
Yeah, it's kind of obvious. You know, you got cat facing, you got, just awkward
Hey, don't give it away.
Oh, yeah, but just all these different things that,
Right.
We blame everything on the environment if we don't know what it is.
Yeah,
So
it must be environmental.
We lump it into it. So it's environmental. It's the weather.
Right.
So, but in this case, in a few of these cases that we're going to talk about, yes, it is the weather, or it's just kind of common. We just kind of see them, and so yeah, it's kind of a fun one to do as well. So again, this is the third part. So I hope these are going to be useful for everybody to kind of refer back to. And like I said, we've been kind of going off our fact sheets. So 1, 2, and 3. So if you watch this, pull out one of these 3 fact sheets, and you can kind of follow through and get a little more detailed. That's growing tomatoes is a challenge, and it's easier to go to the store and buy them, but that takes the fun out of it. So we're going to help you through these processes.
Well, this first problem, blossom drop. I mean, we get a lot of questions about this in the garden in our diagnostic center over here.
Yeah.
People are like, hey, my plants quit.
Yeah.
What's the problem?
And it's one of those that it is Mother Nature's fault on blossom drop, or we just don't get enough we don't get enough fruit set. Why is the fruit not setting? Why is that blossom dropping? Mostly temperature. It can be mostly high temperature, but it can be cool temperature as well. But for the most part, we're looking at those higher temperatures when the nights get, when they don't get below 70, 75,
right.
When it just doesn't cool down. So, or on the higher end of that, 85 to 90, pretty much constant throughout the day.
August, basically.
August, July sometimes, right. But when our tomatoes don't set, that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. We got too hot. It burnt. It kind of heated up that pistil, getting into that plant, that male that brings that pollen down that tube. Right. Scientifically, it kind of gets too hot for that thing to take that down. So it just kind of shrivels away and falls off. So if you're seeing a lot of blooms that have fallen down onto the ground, that's more likely what it is. It's just the temperatures haven't been in that range. Right.
So when your fruiting just kind of disappears, that's the hard part to get your tomato plants through that July and August. And in most of them, if you can get them to survive, they'll perk back up as it cools off in the fall and still get like almost another crop.
Still have a kind of a fall crop, if
right.
you will, and taking care of your plants and not getting those diseases and bacteria that we talked about prior to.
Right.
But, blossom drop's a fairly, it's not an easy way to fix. I mean,
there is no fix.
No, if they are losing it, I mean, if we're getting too hot and we can cover our plants up to try to cool it down a little bit with whether it's a sheet or a shade cloth or anything that can help cool it enough. But that's going to be a challenge because usually when we're in those temperatures, we're in them, and we're gonna be in them for a length of time.
Well, and at night, if it doesn't cool down at night, there's really not much.
Much you could fight. It's
just
not, but
be patient.
It is, and another thing, we may fertilize too much. That's kind of number 2 that comes into mind. We've put too much nitrogen on our plants, so they're growing. If they're really growing healthy and growing fast, and our temperatures aren't in that hot range, we could be growing the plant too much and it's not wanting to flower. So that's another thing that blossom drop could be. They just may not be putting out the blossoms. So that's another thing to think of. Don't over fertilize or don't treat your plants too well. You kind of need to stress them a little to cause them to flower in certain cases. So taking off the fertilizer, taking out of the water, not watering them as much, that can help us trigger, hey, I need to reproduce because I'm about to, get into a stressful situation. So they'll start putting on flowers, possibly. Some varieties on these as well can be notorious for not setting fruit or not putting on blossoms. So as in most of these, you're going to hear problems that we are going to talk about today. Varieties is a big deal.
Varieties matter.
Yeah, varieties matter. So, yeah, blossom drop, kind of I think of an obvious one, but, a few things that you make it do different and try to get them past that point.
All right, well, we talked about those diseases previously. This is like an environmental. A lot of these are environmental.
Yep.
And again, there's not a whole lot you can do about it.
Not much there. Kind of a
you
given.
can kind of, but anyway, you're just going to have to deal with it.
Kind of given.
Yep.
The next one, definitely blossom end rot. That's actually a calcium deficiency, Tom. So all we have to do is put calcium on this thing, right?
No. It's rarely a soil calcium deficiency.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
It's typically because of variations in water, too much water.
Yeah. Now, the watering is not consistent. So maybe we skip a couple waterings and it wilts down, and then we flood it and hydrate it heavily, and then we may not get back to it again for a few days with water, and then it's droughted again. So
Right.
over that pattern over time will cause calcium not to be able to be taken up from the plant, and definitely get calcium throughout that fruit. So you'll usually see this, or this will be towards the end, towards that blossom end of that tomato, not the stem end.
Right.
So you'll usually see browning. That browning, this has progressed pretty good, and there's rot that's got in here. So there's some fungus that has got in here, but that damage is that blossom end starts turning brown, and then it just gets bigger and bigger when it can't pull up enough when it can't use enough calcium within that plant. So you'll see this.
In theory, yes, it is a calcium deficiency. However, adding more calcium is not going to be the fix, because it's the moisture, the wetness has affected the roots. To inhibit it uptaking the calcium,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter how much calcium is there.
Yeah, and you can put Tums in the bottom, or you can put any
Yeah,
other
do
type
that, yeah.
of calcium in there, but it still won't pull it up. Or spray calcium even. I've seen that on the stores.
Right.
May help a little, but not enough to be messing with.
More standard watering
Yeah,
practices.
mulch it in, and then water more consistently, and that will help. Or in some cases, like I said, varieties get it real bad. So there's some Roma tomatoes out there that I've grown that I couldn't get a ripe fruit because of this thing.
Yeah.
So I blamed it on, it wasn't me that was not watering it right.
Of course not.
It was the variety.
It must have been the weather that year.
It was bad. So yeah, like I said, those Romas, that particular one of mine was Romas. I ended up just pulling the plant out because it wasn't producing anything worthwhile. So so varieties, maybe changing a variety next year. If you've had a couple years in a row that you've had this on the one you like, the variety you like, switch it out and see if that helps. Possibly. But yep, blossom end rot.
Catface, which is kind of an interesting name for this, but again, an environmental thing.
It is, and a variety thing too. You know those big beef eaters and some of them big ones.
Right.
They tend to have some of those weird lines and cat facing on the backside.
Right.
But this one in general is going to be low temperatures.
It's gotten too cold.
It's got too cold. So we're trucking along real good in June, July, May and June, and then we get a cold snap, 60-degree weather that the plant's not used to.
Right.
Anything below that could possibly cause this to happen.
And that's it causes an abnormal development in the flower
Yeah.
itself. So that's what has come to pass here. That shows up in the fruit
Shows
later.
up in the fruit later on. Yep, later on. And just like on the other one, this thing's good to eat. It's fine to eat. You just cut it off and go on. But it has cracked that skin, exposed that flesh to be open. So all those sugars in that tomato is open and ready for a fungus to get in there and start rotting it. Right. And that's usually what happens. We start rotting, and then we lose that fruit there. That fruit's not sellable, but for homeowners, it's pretty good to, you can usually cut it off and go on if it's not too bad.
So it's not diseased, it's more of a cosmetic.
Yeah,
It affects the development of the fruit.
Yeah. Early on, and then as it progresses and ripens, it can rot. But cat facing's pretty, again, variety. Variety. Some are pretty notorious to have cat facing, but change it up. And this is, again, hammers the fact down that we don't want to plant one type of tomato. We want as many different ones as we can get out there, because some will have it, some won't. So another important thing to keep in mind when we're planting, getting ready to plant.
Which we're doing now.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep. So that was cat face.
Next up, we got Sunscald, this one, unless you can block out the sun, there's not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot you can do.
But it's a direct sunlight, right? Either because your plant's not robust enough, it's not getting a lot of cover from the leaves.
Yeah, yeah.
So that August, we say August, that July, August sun is hitting them, and
yeah, and then just melting, burning the top of that fruit. Right. And it's usually going to be at the top, and you'll usually see this really quick because you're going to see it because it's exposed as well.
Right.
In variety trials and variety selections, sometimes we get tomatoes that produce so many tomatoes and don't produce enough leaves. So,
right.
That can happen in this case where we don't have enough leaves to kind of shade it out. Then it's going to tend to burn. So we may have produced a whole bunch of fruit on that particular variety that we're trying out. If we don't have enough leaves to cover it, then it won't do us any good. So they are going to scald, and there's going to be issues. So
can you do a physical cover?
You can. I've seen people put sheets over, just plain white sheets, maybe 4 stakes, or something to help break that heat of the day sun up, and that's that 3 to 5 o'clock, 3 to 6 o'clock range. If we can block that sun out, and then everything else can be exposed, that'll be fine. But anything to help keep that away, promote healthy plants, promote healthy leaves is going to help as well. But you're always going to get a few of these. That's going to happen, and if we don't have as many leaves this year, then it'll be a better year for Sunscald, if you will. But no sunscreen you can put on them or anything like that. But maybe a sheet or something, right. Just to get them through that heat of the day.
Or plant them in a way where maybe they get some shading from that late afternoon sun. I know where mine are, the house shades that 3 to 5 o'clock sun out of there, so it doesn't get that beat down every day.
So you don't have that
I've never had
difficult.
I've had some of the others.
Yeah, of course.
So, and then next we've got this herbicide injury, which is not necessarily herbicide you've applied to these plants, but herbicide drift.
Yeah,
right?
drift is an issue with us, and we use quite a few different hormone herbicides that does tend to volatilize and move. So, we've got to be careful using those, whether it's you used them or your neighbor used them or, somebody else applied 2 blocks away, and then they volatilized up and moved over and then went back down. That can happen too. So that's one of the reasons we got to be careful when we're applying herbicides, and then any particular ones, because this particular one is pretty bad on these tender, fast-growing tomatoes, and then any other plants like that. Peppers get it as well, eggplants. Roses, a lot of things can be affected by herbicide damage that we didn't necessarily apply to that site, but they moved over to it. So yeah.
Well, for example, the 2 of them that get listed are 2,4-D and dicamba, which are very popular for weeds in your yard. So if you're out there with a sprayer and you're spraying this on your yard, and those sprayers, part of it goes to mist.
Yeah.
Anyway, and if you're just right out there next to your vegetable garden and that mist is kind of drifting over to your plants, you've got a potential problem.
Pretty easily done that way, yeah. So, we've got to, it's kind of odd because this is time where we don't want just no wind at all. We want a little bit of wind when we apply our herbicides, and what that does, that gets it out of there. If we had no wind at all, it's going to hit, and then it may sit or it may rise a little bit, move, and then we get maybe just, and then drops. Those droplets can drop over. So we actually need a little bit of wind to get that out of there. But again, hammers the fact home. This is, it usually happens when we, on tender growth, newer growth, so it may happen at the top, or it may start showing up at the top. Where the bottom, the more mature, thicker leaves may not curl as much as these top tender leaves would. But curl, cupping, we'll have a good picture of this on there, but those veins straighten up and it kind of makes a cup. So the veins in general on a tomato leaf are net-like. There's really no pattern. There's just kind of a net-like pattern is all it is. And when we see damage, herbicide injury, those veins tend to straighten up. So they'll tend to, it's odd, they'll straighten up and then it'll usually form a cup or a tip at the end of the leaf. So kind of things to look at. It's not necessarily fatal. This particular plant, it's hard to see, but I would probably go in and prune this out a little bit and see if we can get some new growth that's not affected. it's not necessarily in the plant, but it's that tender growth that can't fight that off. That's why it's curling up, and why the older ones are not really affected. It's still there, they just aren't affected as much as the tender ones are.
Right. So if you see something like that, you go like, that may be what's going on.
Don't necessarily take a shotgun over to your neighbor and say this is your fault, because it's never that easy. You never can figure out where it come from unless it's obvious and you knew that you sprayed that day and showed up a couple days later. But it just takes neighbors. Keep your neighbors friends and keep them friends.
Along.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Next is this other one that's physiological leaf roll.
Yeah, so this one occurs later on in the season. 2,4-D damage and herbicide damage will occur earlier on, so till about June, and it'll happen throughout, but it mostly happens when we're applying a lot of weed controls, and that's going to on the 2,4-D damage or herbicide damage. So April, May, June, if we're seeing curling and cupping, more than likely that's going to be herbicide damage. Don't see a lot of this during that time. We're seeing a lot of this in July and August when the temperatures are a little warm and it's just kind of the plant's kind of mad and just starts curling leaves. And it's about the only way to explain it.
Is this a varietal thing as well, or not?
As in with all the others, some varieties are notorious to do
More
this
susceptible.
later in the season. Yeah, later in the season. So, it's not hurting anything. I mean, you're curling it up and the plant's not going to be as robust and big, and it may not ripen the fruit as fast. And this fruit may be subject to sunburn or sunscald. So it's not necessarily a killer, but it's one of those that we probably need to, it's probably getting on its last leg at that point.
Right.
But they're still making photosynthesis, still creating some stuff and growing, but it's just not growing as robust as it was. So.
Right. And like you said, a lot of these things can contribute to another condition, like this contributes to the Sunscald.
The Sunscald,
so it's likely not just a one issue thing.
Yeah, and it's kind of like that oil and gas on the nutrients. If you don't have everything right, then not everything will grow very well. But you want to blame us on lack of water, but it's not always. It's usually a stressor that causes it, and it's usually the temperature and the moisture in August that causes it. But yeah, prune it out the best you can. See if that helps. See if you can get it through those next month, and then if you can probably get a fall crop. The plant can grow, and if it can flower again, it should be good to go. So, but physiological leaf row, kind of one of those odd things we see. So.
All right, so that concludes our 3-part series on tomato issues, and we'll see if the tomato sales in Tulsa County
decrease.
Down.
We don't want them to decrease.
But we've both grown tomatoes, and we've seen maybe some of these, but not all of them. It's like just sporadic problems.
And it is, and one year you may see one, and one year you may see the other. But like we've kind of described, you've got 3 different ones. You've got the fungus. There's a whole bunch of those, and we talked about that. You've got the bacteria and viruses, and then nematodes. So the bacteria is a little challenging because they all look similar, but the treatment's very close too, and there's not a lot. I mean, you've got copper to add with your fungicides. That may help us a little to slow down a little bit of them bacteria that we talked about. And then you got these natural non-infectious diseases that we hit today, and that one, those are, kind of Mother Nature, blame it on her, and then, hopefully do a few things. We're going to be able to grow tomatoes. We've always been able to. It's just job security for us.
So if you get tomatoes, if you get delicious tomatoes in your garden, good job.
Good job. You done good. That's right.
All these things you could have been challenged with, but you ended up with a good fruit.
Yeah, it's a fun challenge, and we'll grow tomatoes and do good and still have salsa. So it's all good.
Well, I hope so.